Welcome to Whiskey Cast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 801 for January 12th, 2020. Coming up in a few minutes.
This week in the western part of Kentucky, they're predicting 6 inches of rain, and the Mississippi River is already above flood stage. That's not normal in a January, February setting.
Over the course of 2020, we'll be focusing from time to time on the ways climate change could affect the whiskey industry worldwide. And since whiskey starts with grain, that's where we'll start. Dr. Chad Lee tracks grain markets worldwide and the impact on the whiskey industry as part of his work at the University of Kentucky. And he's already watching the rivers rising in the Midwest once again this winter. He'll join us later on Whiskey Cast in Depth. We'll also have the What I'm Tasting This Week department, your voice, behind the label, and much more. All on this episode of Whiskey Cast.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of Whiskey Cast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's start with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. This is going to be an important week for the whiskey industry in Washington. The public comment period ends Monday on the Trump administration's proposal to expand its punitive import tariffs on single malt whiskeys from Scotland and Northern Ireland, along with other European goods. That clears the way for the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative to announce a potential increase in the 25% tariff on those whiskeys that was imposed last October. The new tariff could be as high as 100%. And U.S. officials are also threatening to add tariffs on other whiskeys from throughout the European Union as part of the long-running dispute between the U.S. and the EU over aircraft subsidies. Scotch Whisky Association leaders will be in Washington this week. They'll be working with their counterparts at the Distilled Spirits Council and other industry trade groups to try and persuade the Trump administration to leave whiskey out of the dispute. Chris Swanger is the CEO of Discus.
Obviously, the distilled spirits industry has suffered from collateral damage as a result of that, and we're working at the various highest levels of the Trump administration and with the EU to try to get these matters resolved as quickly as possible.
Swanger will travel to Brussels later this month for a similar set of meetings with European Union officials. In other news, MGP executives are reviewing their legal options after the Indiana Court of Appeals rejected the company's bid to overturn a lower court ruling siding with the government agency that provides sewer service for MGP's distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana. Back in 2017, the South Dearborn Regional Sewer District decided that it would no longer offer service directly to MGP's distillery. The district covers Lawrenceburg and the nearby towns of Greendale and Aurora, and district officials decided that the distillery should become a Lawrenceburg customer, with the city setting its sewer rates. When that district was established back in 1972, Seagram's was one of the owners of the sewer system, along with the three towns and the old Shenley distillery next door. Over time, both distilleries eventually gave up their ownership interests, but MGP's lawsuit argued that it still had the right to be treated as a direct customer. It claimed the change would significantly increase the distillery's wastewater treatment costs, but the appeals court rejected MGP's assertions. Company executives declined to comment on the ruling or whether it will be appealed to the Indiana Supreme Court. A couple of weeks ago, we reported on the $600,000 fine Jim Beam is paying the state of Kentucky for environmental damage from last July's warehouse fire in Woodford County. Spilled whiskey from the fire led to a massive fish kill stretching over 62 miles of Glens Creek, the Kentucky River, and the Ohio River. After that story, we received some comments from listeners asking whether that money would actually be used to restore habitat damage or just go into the state's general fund. I checked with the Kentucky Energy and Environment Cabinet. We got the details this week after the holidays. Beam's fine was part of about $1.7 million in civil penalties collected so far this fiscal year by the state in environmental cases. Under state law, the first $150,000 from those penalties is earmarked for the Kentucky Environment Education Council, while the rest goes into the Kentucky Heritage Land Conservation Fund. The state allocates half of that money to nonprofit land trust organizations, colleges and universities, and government agencies at the state and local level, while the other half is split between the State Parks Department, the State Fish and Wildlife Department, the Division of Forestry, the Nature Preserves Commission, and the final 10% goes to protect wild rivers corridors. However, there is also a provision that gives the governor and the legislature the option to move some or all of that money into the general fund. That happened in 2016 and 2018 under former Governor Matt Bevin's administration to close budget gaps. Now that the holidays are over, we are getting word on the first new whiskey releases of 2020. Woodford Reserve is releasing its annual bottling of Double Oaked Bourbon in its Distilleries Series range. It takes the standard Woodford Reserve Double Oaked Bourbon and gives it an extra year in a new, heavily toasted and lightly charred barrel. It's only available at the distillery and select Kentucky retailers for around $50 a bottle. Also out of Kentucky, the Bardstown Bourbon Company is releasing a new collaboration with the Prisoner Wine Company in California. The Prisoner takes a 9-year-old sourced Tennessee bourbon and gives it 18 months in the same casks that are used for the Prisoner's Napa Valley red wine. It'll be available in Kentucky, Indiana, California, Florida, Tennessee, and Illinois. And by the way, Bardstown Bourbon announced plans to expand this year into Texas, Colorado, Nevada, Ohio, Delaware, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. Utah's High West is out with its annual release of a Midwinter Nights Dram. That one takes the distillery's Rendezvous Rye blend of straight rye whiskeys and finishes it in a combination of port and French oak barrels. It's available on a limited basis. No word on pricing. And speaking of rye, we are seeing the first rye whiskey out of the O.Z. Tyler Distillery in Owensboro, Kentucky. Wheelhouse Rye Whiskey is not an official distillery bottling. It's from Latitude Beverage and uses 2- and 3-year-old rye whiskeys distilled right after O.Z. Tyler reopened in 2016. It's the former Charles Medley Distillery. It's important to note that while the O.Z. Tyler Distillery is the home base for Terrascentia's rapid aging technology, that process was not used on this whiskey. Wheelhouse Rye will sell for around $27.99 a bottle in the U.S. I received a sample this week, and I'll have tasting notes for it soon at the WhiskeyCast website. The Lunar New Year is coming up January 25th, and Johnnie Walker is out with its annual Lunar New Year release of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. This year's edition is named the Year of the Rat Edition, and the bottle features artwork by artist Shirley Gong. It's on sale for around $300 a bottle. Finally, I've mentioned the whiskey documentary film, The Amber Light, that features Dave Broom several times over the last year or so. It'll finally be shown in North America for the first time this coming week as part of the Santa Barbara International Film Festival in Southern California. There will be several showings between January 16th and the 24th. Director Adam Park will do some Q&A sessions after showings on the 22nd and the 24th. We have a link to the festival's website with a complete schedule of showings, in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. And that's also where you can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Larceny Bourbon's heritage goes back to the days when Treasury Agent John E. Fitzgerald was patrolling the rickhouses of Kentucky, not just for the feds, but also for himself. He was stealing a taste of some of his favorite barrels of wheated bourbon on the side. Today's award-winning Larceny Bourbon has that same soft, smooth character Fitzgerald loved. Look for 92 proof Larceny Bourbon at your local retailer, and be on the lookout for the new limited edition release of Larceny Barrel Proof. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Time now for the Whiskey Cast calendar of events. It's going to be a busy week in Western Canada. The Edmonton MS Whiskey Festival is Wednesday night, followed by the Calgary MS Whiskey Festival Thursday night. That's the same night the Victoria Whiskey Festival gets underway in Victoria, British Columbia, with the annual Canadian Whiskey Awards presentation. The festival runs through next Sunday, and I'll have complete coverage from Victoria next time around. Elsewhere, McTeers has its first whiskey auction of the year on Friday in Glasgow, Scotland. The first Hot Dram Whiskey Festival is January 22nd in Chicago. The National Whiskey Festival is January 25th in Glasgow, and Fine and Rare in New York City is hosting a Robert Burns brunch that same day. Hansa Spirit is January 30th through February 2nd in Hamburg, Germany. The Malt Mania Summit is on the 2nd in Tokyo. The Highlander Whiskey Festival is February 7th and 8th in Alkmaar, the Netherlands, and tickets are still available for this year's World Whiskey Forum at Westland Distillery in Seattle, Washington, February 18th through the 20th. Right now, we have 311 different events on the searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. You'll find everything from whiskey festivals and tastings to cocktail classes and classes that combine whiskey tasting and yoga. If you're looking for something to do, click on the search button to find out what's happening near you.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Whiskey Cast In Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. No matter what industry you work in, there really is no way to avoid the issue of climate change. When you look at images of the bushfires currently charring millions of acres of land in Australia, only the most committed climate change deniers can't see the connection between the Earth's rising temperatures, rising seas, and more apocalyptic natural disasters like the fires in Australia. Take, for instance, the trend of so-called 100-year floods that seem to happen almost annually now in the grain belt, the upper U.S. Midwest, where generations of farmers grow grain for everything from making whiskey to feeding the world's growing population. Right now, farmers in the Midwest are working on their tractors, combines, and other equipment to get ready for planting season in the spring. Winter wheat and other cold weather crops are out in the field now, and the rivers are already rising. In fact, many of the monitoring stations along the Mississippi River between Hannibal, Missouri, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, are reporting river levels approaching flood stage, with minor flooding in a few areas. Dr. Chad Lee of the University of Kentucky's College of Agriculture focuses on grain and the environment. He heads up the college's Grain and Forage Center of Excellence. And those roles put him right on the front lines of climate change, agriculture, and whiskey.
Let's talk first of all about what we've seen the last couple of years, because there has been a lot of flood damage each spring in the upper Midwest and along the Mississippi River that I know has at least had some effect on the farmers who grow grain up through there. What did we see at the end of the years for these farmers?
One, we just saw fewer acres planted. I talked to a farmer yesterday on the Mississippi River who only planted 60% of his intended acreage last year. And he wasn't alone in that regard. So we had reduced acreage to begin with. The farmers that were able to get planted, we had relatively good crops for most of the area. The challenge was, you mentioned the upper Midwest. The upper Midwest had a lot of challenges in getting stuff harvested. And I know a lot of corn was in the fields, may still be in the fields in some of the Minnesota, Dakota areas where they had a terrible time getting stuff out of the field. I know Michigan had troubles with that. They also had shortages in LP gas, so they couldn't dry the grain, forcing them to leave it in the fields to try to get it to dry down naturally, and conditions just did not favor any of that.
So what does this do to the whiskey industry then? We know that whiskey doesn't take a lot of the crop, but it does take a significant percentage of it.
Yeah, well, the good news on that is the majority of the whiskey growing region was relatively in good shape this year. And so we have enough corn that we're going to be able to supply the whiskey demand for this coming season. We also have, now that part of the challenge, though, to your point, is the small grains. So some of our bourbons have wheat in them, and our wheat came off in really good shape. And we have good, high-quality wheat that I know is being used. The rye and the barley come from northern climates, so that Minnesota, the Dakotas, Canada, or Germany. And I know in the rye production system, they had really poor growing conditions in Canada and in Germany last year. And last year's rye crop was down quite a bit. We have some farmers that are locally growing some rye, and we had some buyers that were looking for additional rye locally to try to supplement what they normally get out of those other states.
What about barley? We know the beer folks rely on a lot of barley, but the distillers do too, to a certain extent.
Right. They rely on the malting barley, and I didn't hear near as many concerns about the barley as I did the rye. But I was also, as a caveat, I was more focused on rye because of some projects we've got going on. But I've not heard that the barley was as bad.
How is this comparing to previous years? Are we seeing an impact from climate change yet? Are we too soon to see this impact? Where do we stand here?
Well, we had this discussion yesterday in our winter wheat meeting, and so with our growers and such, we have had the last 3 winters have been a little bit wetter and on average a little bit warmer. That doesn't mean we haven't gotten into freezing temperatures, but we've been a little bit warmer. Again, now I'm talking about this region where we grow grains for bourbon. The Ohio River Valley is where I'm making that reference to. We've definitely been wetter. We've definitely been warmer. That's affected our winter crops like wheat, and it's affected us in terms of insect management. With the last 3 years were problematic years for head scab in our small grain, and that's detrimental to the wheat crop. A crop that has head scab in it is not going to be used for distillation, and so you limit the supply some that way. So we're managing for that. We've also had some very wet springs, which has made it a challenge to get our corn planted. But on the flip side, we've had plenty of water for the most part. We've had plenty of water during the grain fill period. And so people that were able to get corn planted have actually had a decent crop in terms of final grain fill.
What are you hearing for this year?
Well, in terms of the winter wheat, we're in the same pattern we've been in the last few years. We're a little bit wetter than normal. We're a little bit warmer than normal. Some of our wheat got in very late because the fall was so wet, and that wheat has finally caught back up. But in terms of what we see going forward, we just don't know what we're going to end up with. It does appear that we're in a cycle of some wetter weather with some extreme wet weather. This weekend, the western part of Kentucky, they're predicting 6 inches of rain, and the Mississippi River is already above flood stage. That's not normal in the January, February setting.
And it does not bode well for the rest of the spring, then, if the Mississippi is already above flood stage.
Well, it certainly gives us an implication that, right, because the Mississippi River being above flood stage is more than just this region, right? It's up in Ohio, it's Pennsylvania, Indiana, Illinois. They all feed into that Mississippi River. And that implies that that entire region is extremely wet, and it could make it a challenge as we go into this current season.
This isn't the only place that's growing grain for distillation use and for the whiskey industry. You talked about Germany being a source of rye earlier. What are you hearing from your colleagues around the world? Are we getting to the point where maybe we should be concerned about grain supplies for distillation going forward?
I would say overall, no. We've actually, if you look at just total grain supply on a worldwide basis, the last 3 years, we've actually been in excess in production. And we've been that way globally. Last year, the 2019 year, we had some spots around the world that were showing some drought stress. But the 2 years prior to that, if you looked at global stress, there was very little global stress in terms of water stress, and that their market, what they're documenting there is dryness. So the amount of areas that were showing drought stress conditions were very minimal in 2017 and 2018 across the entire globe, which actually puts us at higher production levels, which means there was a lot of grain out there. But for distillation, as you're probably well aware, at least in the bourbon industry, they like to use fresh grain. So they want to use grain that isn't carryover from previous years. And so they're relying on this 2019 crop that was just harvested this past fall to get them through most of the 2020 season of distillation, and then they'll pick up fresh grain again in about October of 2020. And so while we've had several years where global production has been extremely high, which means we've got some carryover stocks of grain for livestock feed, our distillery folks, they really rely on the grain each year. They want as fresh grain as possible. And what happens when you have this kind of water is getting good grain quality. You might get good yield, but if you've got too much water at harvest, you can end up with other problems that a distiller might have to fight.
How are we doing in terms of prices for the grain when you do get it?
Prices are depressed right now. So if you're a distiller, at some level, that means you're buying a little bit cheaper grain, but prices have been depressed for about 3 years now. They kind of reflect what we've seen on that global market. There's been a downturn in total livestock. So livestock is still the biggest consumer of grain. All the trade wars stuff going on has disrupted our markets as well. The timing of that wasn't helpful when you had these other issues already putting pressure on the market. And so from a farmer standpoint, usually distillation grain means premium grain, and those premiums are extremely helpful in this kind of economic environment.
I know a lot of the farmers have long-term contracts with distillers to sort of protect them, right?
A lot of them do, and a lot of them, at least here, a lot of them are very local arrangements, long-term relationships and such, and I think they realize they need each other to be successful.
One of the things we've seen on the wine side of things is as average temperatures start to rise with climate change, we're seeing more and more grape varieties that are moving north in terms of where they can be grown because they're getting too warm in the localities where they're grown now. Is that something we have to look at with grain at some point?
It is. Corn is a little more adaptable. So corn, it originated in the subtropics, and it is highly adaptable. We've got a lot of different varieties of corn. We can grow in a lot of different conditions, and so it's just a matter of maybe switching some varieties. You talk about the grape varieties. You may switch some corn varieties to adjust to some temperature differences in climate in your local region. The one that will be more interesting to follow, though, will be the small grains. It'll be the wheat, the barley, and the rye. Those three grains are so sensitive to temperature when they're going through seed fill, particularly high temperatures. Currently, rye in particular, it's really grown in northern climates and kind of on the northern edge of where we do agriculture, at least row crop agriculture. And so it's going to be really curious to see how, as those temperatures increase, you would think initially that that's going to result in a little bit lower rye yields, a little bit lower barley yields, lower test weights. Test weights are important to the distillers. And so you would think some of those things are going to be issues. Where the annual crops like the rye, the barley, the corn have an advantage over grapes is that you do have plant breeders and geneticists that are constantly trying to develop new varieties. And as they develop those new varieties, they're developing those varieties in the systems that are changing. And so if the climate's getting warmer, they're developing these newer genetics in this warmer climate. And so you would think that over time, our plant breeders will be able to help us keep up pace with what we see in terms of temperature changes. The bigger challenge in all of that is rainfall, because it's not just a matter of getting more rainfall, it's that we're getting large amounts of rainfall in very short periods of time. And then we go through stretches where we're dry. We saw that this year in central Kentucky, south central Indiana, southern Ohio, where July and August got very dry, and any corn that was planted a little bit later went through a drought stress period and actually lost yield because of drought stress. But from an annual basis, we're 20 inches over average on our rainfall. So anybody that looks back at our season says, well, we had plenty of rain, which we did, but we just didn't get all of it when we needed it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense because you can't have it all at the beginning of the season. You need it spread out throughout the season, I would assume. Exactly.
And so what we're forced to do is that really puts a challenge on us to make soils more resilient to these extreme weather events. And so we've put a lot of research and effort into not just growing a good crop, but how do we make our soils more resilient over time to potentially handle these changes we think we see coming in the climate.
Especially when you've got floodwaters that wash away a lot of the topsoil off that top layer.
Yeah, now that's something we don't have ability to overcome just yet. Outright floodwaters like that coming in, that's a really tough one to overcome, because that's when you lose that topsoil, you've lost thousands of years of history.
What scares you the most about climate change, the way it works with agriculture?
I think what concerns me the most about it is I think these gaps in rainfall events can drastically affect the crop where it's being grown, and that's not always going to be captured in the international markets when they're looking at rainfall patterns and they're trying to estimate what kind of crop we're going to have. And so I don't know that the prices are going to reflect that, but I think my bigger concern is probably we're going to see changes in pests that come into each of these systems. And so weeds that are more predominant maybe in Georgia today, 20 years from now might be the weeds we're trying to fight in Kentucky. Insects that are very prevalent in a place like Georgia today might be something that we've got to fight against 10 to 20 years from now. And I think those are our greater challenges. I also think agriculture has a chance to be part of the solution on climate issues. If we can develop more resilient systems, if we can develop systems where we're getting really good grain yields, but we're also putting biomass back into the system, I think that's going to be beneficial to us overall.
The thing I would question is, and I wonder is whiskey production sustainable long term? Can we continue at this pace with annual growth rates as we're seeing and still be able to make it work with the demand for crops for food and other uses?
Oh, really good question. The short answer there is yes. Yes, we can. Because you made the comment before, while here locally, bourbon whiskey is extremely critical to our local corn market. There's a whole lot more corn that's used in animal feed. That we export more corn than we currently put into our whiskey from a national perspective. No, we're okay that way. With the corn side, I'm not worried about the corn at all. I am more worried about rye longer term and that component of the whiskey. And that one's the one that concerns me.
Can we find another source for rye other than Germany?
Well, we're working on that. We're trying to grow. We grew it here 100 years ago. We grew it in Kentucky. It was part of any local mash bill had rye in it for the most part. And obviously they were getting that rye off their own farms or their neighbors' farms. at the time. Rye went away right around the time Prohibition came in, and it never really came back. And we are trying to reestablish rye in our system here, and we're trying to do the same thing with barley. I think that could help us some. If we could have it in more regions of the world, I think that's helped the global production questions that we deal with. So I think those are where some of the challenges come in.
Thanks to Dr. Chad Lee of the University of Kentucky's College of Agriculture for joining us this week. We'll be taking a close-up look in future episodes this year at other areas where climate change could impact the whiskey industry, including forestry, water quality, and even the availability of water for distilleries in the future. By the way, the James B. Beam Institute for Kentucky Spirits at the University of Kentucky will be holding its first-ever industry conference February 27th in Lexington. We have a link for details at the WhiskyCast website. And if you have some suggestions for stories you'd like to see in this series, please share them with us. You can use the contact form at whiskycast.com or email us. The address, comments@whiskycast.com. That's WhiskyCast In Depth, brought to you by Mortlock, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlock lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit. One of my goals for this year is to clear out the backlog of whiskey samples on my tasting table, and I made a big dent in that goal this week. Let's start off with an interesting rye whiskey from the Blom brothers, Matt and Mike, in Galena, Illinois. Their Old Straight Rye is a 4-year-old whiskey made from 92% rye, 5% smoked malt, and 3% regular malted barley. It's bottled at 50% ABV, and the nose has notes of black tea, toasted caramel, and vanilla, along with muted baking spices, a touch of old leather, brown sugar, and charred oak. The taste is spicy and complex, with good notes of clove, cinnamon, and a hint of chili powder, balanced by honey, toasted vanilla, caramel, and a slightly herbal touch. The finish is long and well-balanced with a good complexity and notes of maple, spearmint, and black tea. I'm scoring the Blom Brothers Distilling Company's Old Straight Rye a 93. While I was watching a hockey game on TV the other night, I dug into the latest releases in the J.P. Weiser's NHL Alumni Series of Canadian whiskies. The 3 whiskeys honor Hockey Hall of Fame members Mark Messier, Yvonne Cournoyer, and Dave Keon, and each of them worked with Dr. Don Livermore to help blend the whiskeys that carry their names. Let's focus on the Messier edition. It's an 11-year-old whiskey that's finished in barrels brought over from Scotland that had previously been used for a Speyside single malt, and it's bottled at 47% ABV. The nose is warm and smooth, with notes of caramel, honey, linseed oil, and butterscotch. The taste has a pepperiness that's a sharp contrast to the smooth nose, along with a bit of fruity tartness and hints of honey and butterscotch in the background. The finish is long with a lingering touch of spices and sweet notes of caramel and butterscotch. I'm scoring the J.P. Weiser's NHL Alumni Series Mark Messier edition a 92. You'll find my notes for the Yvonne Cournoyer and Dave Keon editions at the WhiskyCast website. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Rye whiskey was distilled by America's original risk-takers and history makers. Those first barrels of whiskey were bold, flavorful, and full of passion. Sagamore Spirit proudly picked up the torch with their spring-fed Maryland-style rye whiskey. It celebrates the grit and glory of those patriotic ancestors who sipped their way into American history. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com to explore their award-winning spirit. Glendronach recently released batch number 8 of its cask-strength single malt scotch. It's finished in a combination of Pedro Jimenez and Oloroso sherry casks. It's bottled at 61% ABV, and the nose has notes of oak, coffee beans, dark chocolate, hints of sandalwood and roasted cashews, and a touch of honey throat lozenges. The taste has a great balance of dark fruits, caramel candy, chocolate-covered cherries, and a hint of espresso. The finish is long with hints of espresso, chocolate-covered cherries, licorice, and honey. I'm scoring Glendronach's cask strength batch number 8 a 93. And finally, I received a sample a while back of the Maker's Mark RC6 bourbon. It's the first release in the Maker's Mark Wood Finishing Series that's an outgrowth of the distillery's Private Select program. This one is finished in barrels with some staves that were seasoned for 18 months before being toasted in a convection oven. RC6 is bottled at 53.9% ABV. The nose has fruity notes of peaches, apricots, and red apples, along with honey, vanilla, muted spices, and a hint of sawdust. The taste starts off slightly dry at first, followed by a good buildup of clove and cinnamon spices that don't overpower sweeter notes of peaches, apricots, and a touch of honey. The finish, long, smooth, with a nice fruity character. I'm scoring the Maker's Mark RC6 bourbon a 91. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of more than 2,750 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of single pot still Irish whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Time now to open up the inbox for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. Had several comments on last week's episode and the Bourbon Salon panel with distillers Joyce Nethery, Lisa Wicker, and Pam Heilman, along with host Michael Veach. Yvonne Stolja posted this on our Facebook page. Good show. As a manufacturer, I'm jealous of the camaraderie in the distilling industry. In my industry, the other guys will shank you faster than you can blink. And Anna at Will Run for Whiskey posted this on our Instagram feed. I really enjoyed this episode and hearing from these awesome distillers. Any chance we could have a few more like that? Perhaps showcasing Molly Troop from Freeland Spirits, or in partnership with Women of the Vine in Spirits. Sure, Anna. We're always looking for interesting distillers to talk with, and thank you for the suggestion. Last time around, we marked the 800th episode of WhiskyCast, and thanks to everyone who sent along their congratulations and comments. I'm going to share just one of them from the folks at the Bourbon Lens podcast. Wow. And to the listeners, it seems so effortless. WhiskyCast, you have our utmost respect. Our podcast is only 52 episodes young, and it's been an incredible journey. We have you to thank for a lot of what we do. Cheers. Well, thank you for the kind words, and congratulations on getting to 50 episodes. That is a feat in itself. And just to clear up the misconception that the inbox is always full of unicorns and rainbows, here's proof that there are a few turds in the punch bowl from time to time. Linus Stick 1 tweeted this comment on Friday. I can tell by his annoying sing-song voice, WhiskyCast guy wears bow ties regularly and at one point had thick mutton chops. Some voices you can just tell. Bow tie? Only with a tuxedo, as God and James Bond intended. Mutton chops? Oh, hell, I've never even had lamb chops when it comes to sideburns. Annoying sing-song voice? Yeah, I'll work on that. Some people just aren't happy unless they're not happy about something. If you're happy about something and you'd like to share it with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always find us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at WhiskeyCast. Of course, you can also just email us if you're not into that whole social media thing. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. And your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and all the other things that combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. The other day, Liquor.com published an interesting article by Brad Jaffe. It was titled, Does the World Really Need a 100-Year-Old Single Malt Scotch Whiskey? His piece centered on Gordon and MacPhail, which has released 3 of the oldest single malts on record so far, the Generations Mortlach 75-Year-Old and the 70-Year-Old Mortlach and Glenlivet Generations releases. There is also a 72-year-old Macallan out there that was an official distillery bottling. Now, the premise of Brad's article was that Gordon and MacPhail is the most likely candidate to one day release that mythical 100-year-old single malt, and I'd agree with him. Unlike many independent bottlers, Gordon and MacPhail has had contracts with distilleries for decades to have their own casks filled with new make spirit, and that lets them control the maturation from start to finish instead of buying casks from brokers. It's been about 10 years or so since now retired managing director Michael Urquhart took me through their warehouse in Elgin, and while the family won't say what older casks they still have on hand, I remember noticing a few that would have been in the 60-year-old range at that point. Now, there's no guarantee those casks will ever be bottled, since the Urquharts won't bottle an old whiskey that does not taste good. And, of course, they're monitoring all of those casks to make sure the whiskey inside doesn't fall below 40% ABV. That's the absolute minimum strength that Scotch whiskey can legally be bottled at. Now, we know a Scotch whiskey producer can't legally add anything to its whiskey other than water and perhaps a bit of caramel coloring. But what if there was a way to actually remove some of the water content and raise that alcoholic strength? Well, there is a way, and Brad Jaffe mentioned it in his story. It's called cold fingering and involves sticking an ice-cold metal rod into a barrel. The theory is that water molecules in the barrel will freeze around the rod and come out when you pull it out. If you want to see how this works, there is a way to do it at home. You don't even need a barrel. Just take a bottle of vodka and put it in your freezer, along with a stainless steel bowl and a whiskey stone. Let them all get well below freezing, and then pour the vodka into the bowl, followed by the whiskey stone. You'll see ice build up around the whiskey stone as the water molecules in the vodka come out of solution and freeze to the stone. When you take the stone out, the vodka will actually be slightly stronger than before. And by the way, this is one of the few really good uses for vodka and for whiskey stones. Now, is this legal? Is it ethical? Brad Jaffe describes cold fingering as a somewhat scandalous remedy developed by bigger whiskey producers that, as he puts it, is not exactly legal in the eyes of the Scotch Whisky Association. Now, I've read the entire text of the Scotch Whisky Regulations of 2009, which is the UK's law governing Scotch whisky production. I can't find anything in there that specifically bans this practice. But I also don't have any evidence that whiskey companies are actually doing this. It's probably not exactly one of the most ethical things you could do, and it's not exactly something they'd probably want to admit to anyway. That would probably have the Scotch Whisky Association's legal team tripping over each other in a race to the courthouse. And speaking of the SWA, a lot of people think it's the association that actually enforces those regulations. The law does allow civil enforcement actions to be brought in court by so-called interested parties, and specifically mentions the SWA along with competing whiskey companies. But the primary enforcement is up to trading standards officers in Scotland's local governments, and violations could be penalized with anything from a warning notice to full-scale criminal prosecution. We've posted a link to Brad Jaffe's story in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com, and if you have something you'd like us to look at on a future episode, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, an 18th century style of premium Irish whiskey, blended from single pot still and single malt. Like yourself, it's one of life's treasured rarities, and what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this episode of Whiskey Cast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, links for our WhiskyCast HD videos, and the WhiskyCast tasting panel. And you'll also find a complete archive of all of our past episodes going back to 2005. We love to hear from you. You can always get in touch with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter at WhiskyCast. The email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2020, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.